This presentation will be on the topic of mergers, which is one of my favorite topics regarding firms. And the information that we're going to be going over has come from the following articles. The first one is Lost in Translation, The Effect of Cultural Values on Mergers by Arthur Kenneth R. Ahern. And the second one is Corporate Innovations in Mergers and Acquisitions by the authors Jane Benna and Kai Lee. And we will narrate it in the following order: Amber Payne, Enrique Chavez, Emiliano de Leon, and ending out with Adriana Alvarado. On the agenda today, it's rather simple. We'll, of course, be discussing the Article 1, and the discussion of Article 2 will follow, along with a wrap-up, a synopsis of what we discovered. In Article 1, we start out with the topic of national culture versus corporate culture, and we'll see how one greatly influences the other when it comes to merging two firms. For the two articles that we will be discussing, we have outlined the main topics as follows. For Lost in Translation, it is national culture versus corporate culture, net present value, cost of integration versus synergy gains, merger data, the variables, volumes, and gains, market overview, domestic versus foreign, and cultural effect, volume and gains. And for Article 2, corporate innovations and mergers and acquisitions, it is innovation characteristics and transaction incidents, technological overlap and merger pairing, interaction between technological and product market overlap, technological overlap and post-merger innovation output. National culture versus corporate culture. So I want you to understand what the writers meant when they did their research. They were talking about national culture. To quote the article, national culture is those customary beliefs and values that ethnic, religious, and social groups transmit fairly unchanged from generation to generation. So it's those social norms that we pass on to our children that influence who we are and our behavior, not just in our personal lives, but in the firms we work in as well. They translate there. To understand how the national culture will influence the corporate culture and thus have an impact on mergers, the empirical survey done found 3 variables that had the greatest impact on the desirability and the success of mergers in cross-country or cross-border transactions. These 3 variables are used throughout all analysis in the article. They are the 3 dimensions of effective mergers: trust versus distrust, hierarchy versus egalitarianism, and individualism versus collectivism. It is these 3 variables that have the greatest impact on the volume of mergers undertaken and the gains obtained. Trust versus distrust. It's fairly straightforward. Do you trust the firm you're going to merge with? Do you trust the government from that firm to protect your firm's assets, so patents, intellectual property rights, real property rights? Hierarchy versus egalitarianism. Is everyone equal, or is there a ranking for accountability? This would be an established norm and would be difficult to change in either one of the merging firms. And individualism versus collectivism. How concerned is the individual about their effect on society? It would be very difficult to integrate firms that behave as opposites with this variable. And trying to create synergy when there are differences in these 3 variables can be costly. Mergers are more valuable if synergies are already in place. So net present value, cost of integration versus synergy gains. So the 3 variables that we just discussed, the goal obviously is to have them as closely matched as possible for any merger to another firm, especially a cross-country or cross-border merger, because trying to implement synergy gains when there are differences increase your costs, and that has a negative effect on the net present value. So as the costs go up, trying to implement additional synergy throughout the company, the net present value goes down. And of course, when you're trying to consider whether this is a merger that you want to undertake, if that net present value goes down enough, it may render that investment not worthy. And as we all know, that usually we're weighing our options, our opportunity costs. So we're going to compare this merger with other opportunities that will be available. And if the net present value goes below another opportunity, more than likely we're going to choose the other opportunity. The authors of this article used an empirical equation, specifically the gravity model, to test the effects of the differences in these cultural variables. Both Table 3 and 4 have the following assumptions. They assume that mergers create value, so an increase in volume should correlate to an increase in gains. The data includes all public and private mergers worth at least $1 million. And the empirical equation is followed by a logarithmic transformation. Dummy variables are used to capture each country's fixed effects. And so the use of the Tobit regression, all effects of country level, time, country pair, and year are accounted for. The results are shown in an absolute difference for both the acquire and the target variables. And significance levels are at 10, 5, and 1. So the findings for Table 3 for volume show that the differences in trust and individualism are significant. And when there's differences in those, the effects on cross-border mergers causes the volume to go down. At the same time, when countries share the same legal system and religion, it has a positive effect on the volume of mergers. So overall, cultural differences have a negative effect on cross-border merger volume. In Table 4, in order to account for the possibility of cultural differences at the country level, the authors ran a regression for estimates based on genetic and somatic distance. Genetic being based on DNA differences and somatic based on physical features, hair, eye color. For Table 4 volume findings, Panel A under genetic distance, we find that the differences in trust, individualism, and hierarchy are all significant, and differences in those variables will result in a negative effect on merger volumes. For Panel B under somatic distance, only trust is significant there, having an impact on merger volumes. But overall, the greater the cultural distance between two merger countries, the lower the returns are found.
Hello everyone, my name is Enrique Chavez. I'm going to be continuing the discussion on Article 1. I'm going to be giving a breakdown of the merger data that's discussed inside of the article. And the data, I'll be breaking it down by the cultural relationship to merger acquisitions, volumes, and gains. To start off, I'll give a market overview from domestic mergers versus foreign mergers. Some of the data findings from the Security Data Company. I'll break down some of the cultural variables, specifically focusing on trust, individualism, and hierarchy, and those cultural variable effects on merger acquisitions, volumes, and gains. Let's go ahead and get started. To start off, I want to go ahead and give a market overview of some of the markets that are going to be discussed in this article. Table 1 gives us a market breakdown. It does give us a nice table here listing the 30 largest nations between 1985 and 2008, breaking down their individual mergers by country of domestic mergers, and then does give us a nice row here of total mergers, including foreign, and then does give us a percentage row here that does show the percentage of total mergers that were done in foreign countries. To go ahead and break down this information here, I want to focus on the top 5 countries. The US is sitting at the number 1 spot with 48,037, followed by the UK at 17,558, Canada at 4,872, Australia at 4,688, and Japan at 3,303. What's interesting about this data here is that the US, being as large as it is, only 13.3% of their mergers were actually foreign. And as you can see here, the UK and the US, there is a big change. There is a sharp drop. The UK is much larger domestic merger market, but actually has a much higher foreign market, foreign merger acquisition. percentage than the US does. And what's even a more interesting number is Japan being at the number fifth spot, actually has the smallest of all the numbers for foreign merger acquisitions, sitting at 5.9%. But why do some of these large domestic merger countries have such low cross-border merger percentages, and what affects these foreign merger decisions? I'm going to go ahead and break down that further in the following slide. The article gives us a breakdown of some of the cultural variables that are taken into consideration when it comes down to mergers. Breaking down the cultural variables shown here. The one specifically I want to focus on is going to be trust, hierarchy, and individualism. Panel A does give us a breakdown of these cultural variables at a country level. So these would be the cultural variables that are taken into consideration when it comes down to domestic mergers. So in this case, trust is put at 31.8%, hierarchy at 47.7%, individualism is put at 52.8%, and is the highest of three when taken into consideration for domestic mergers. Panel B continues the breakdown of these cultural variables, but now in this panel, it does show us the cultural variable effects at a country to country level. So it does do a country pair analysis, breaking down, again, focusing on trust, hierarchy, and individualism. When it comes down to foreign merger acquisitions, trust is put at 15.8%, hierarchy is put at 11%, individualism is put at 11.2%, making trust the highest cultural variable that's taken into consideration when making foreign merger acquisitions. This is just going and breaking down some of the information that I just discussed. But how do these cultural variables affect the gains in acquisitions? So let's go ahead and discuss that. The article does break down and makes it possible to see the dollar value and significance of these cultural variables using a Tobit regression. The Tobit regression is designed to estimate the linear regression between variables when there is a missing dependent variable from either country A or country B. And in this case, the missing domestic variable would be the dollar value of the mergers themselves. So taking that aspect out and just making that value constant throughout the different merger data that was collected. In the article, they go ahead and use a dummy value for that domestic. For that dependent variable. That dependent variable, as I did mention, is the aggregated dollar value of the mergers themselves. And in this case, the article uses a dollar value of 1 to keep that as a constant. And basically, the 1 is demonstrating as if the variables or the mergers were done at to gain cash, for example. So breaking that down, the table here does show the significance of each of the regression amounts by either putting stars next to the regression. 10% significance is shown by 1 star next to the number. 5% is shown by 2 stars next to the number, and if the number does have a 1% significance, it is shown by 3 stars. So they did a series of different tests here. The first Tobit regression is breaking down specifically just trust. The regression found that it is at negative 2.681, deemed at 1% significance. The Tobit 2 focuses on hierarchy, at negative 0.727. And then Tobit 3 is individualism at negative 3.096 with a 1% significance. The findings here do prove and do show that cultural variables are highly significant when it comes down to the gains and volumes and acquisitions of mergers from country to country. This is just kind of giving a breakdown of what I just discussed. But yes, culture is very significant when it comes down to merger acquisitions, gains, and volumes. Countries are much more likely to make merger decisions based off of the foreign country's beliefs, their government system, and their trust with that foreign country. And it has been proven, and as the data does show, these cultural variables are highly significant when it comes down to the foreign merger volumes, gains, and acquisitions.
All right, to go ahead and cover some of the Article 1 highlights, we went ahead and covered the 3 cultural dimensions. They're the top 3 questions derived from the empirical cultural survey that determined the viability of cross-culture mergers. In cross-culture mergers, synergy costs are a necessary factor when determining NPV of a transaction. Domestic and foreign merger decisions are greatly influenced by cultural variables such as trust, individualism, and hierarchy, and culture has a great influence on merger acquisitions and their success.
Transitioning over to Article 2, Corporate Innovations and Mergers and Acquisitions, Adriana Alvarado and I, Emiliano de Leon, will be conveying the findings found in this research article. I will begin by covering the first 2 hypotheses this paper offers: innovation characteristics and transaction incidence, and technological overlap in merger pairing. Before we begin exploring the article's findings, it is fundamental to start with the sample distribution of acquirers, target firms, and deals that allow to form control samples using industry and size matching. It compiles acquisitions from January 1984 to December 2006, and they take the form of mergers, acquisitions of majority interest, and acquisitions of assets. Next, the acquired target sample requires participants to be awarded at least 1 patent from 1 to 5 years before the bid announcement. Lastly, the control samples found in the study are formed by pairing the target firm with up to 5 of the closest matches to the acquirer, and vice versa by pairing the acquired with up to 5 of the closest matches to the target firm. This allows to capture M&A clustering in time by industry and to account for any possible influences that the horizontal or vertical relationship between firms might affect merger pairing. Innovation is established to be a driver of value in companies. However, how does innovation play a role in mergers and acquisitions? We will measure this innovation by measuring the size of patent portfolios and research and development expenses found both in acquirers and targets. This leads us to our first hypothesis. Firms with large patent portfolios and low research and development expenses are more likely to become acquirers, while research and development intensive firms with slow growth and patent output are more likely to be acquired. The following are arguments that support this hypothesis. The first is that the reason why those firms are more likely to become acquirers is because it is not feasible to buy innovation, but rather source the innovation. The second argument is that when 2 firms' production functions exhibit externalities to each other, a merger would facilitate coordination that could not be otherwise be achieved between the 2. In the next slide, we will demonstrate the findings. The first finding shows that firms with higher innovation output are more likely to become acquirers. This positive significance can be seen on the top right-hand table on the patent index line. The second finding is that acquirers are more research and development intensive across the average firm, but are less intensive when they're compared to their size, industry, and book-to-market peers. This can be seen by analyzing columns 1, 2, and 3, with 1 having a positive significant coefficient, while 2 and 3 have negative significant coefficients. The third finding explains that firms are less likely to become acquirers if firms rely on past innovation output. This is measured by looking at the sell-sides ratio, with the coefficients being negative and significant. Fourth, firms are more likely to engage in mergers and acquisitions as acquirers if the firms are larger, have faster sales growth, better operating performance, lower book-to-market ratios, and higher prior year stock returns. Lastly, if we look at the bottom table, it shows that there is no significant association between innovation output and the likelihood of a firm becoming a target firm, while there is a positive and significant association between research and development expenses and the likelihood of a firm becoming a target firm. Thus, we can conclude that the results provide strong support for the first hypothesis. Innovative firms are more likely to be involved in merger transactions. Turning over to the second hypothesis, technological overlap and merger pairing, we analyze how interactions between firms may lead to merger pairing decisions, as well as looking at different measures of technological overlap to assess likability of merger pairing. This leads us to our second hypothesis. Mergers are more likely to occur between firms with technological overlap. This hypothesis is sourced by the following 3 channels. Overcoming information asymmetry. If both acquirer and target have similar technologies, it mitigates information asymmetry between the two. Second, leading to economies of scale and scope and innovation. This results from technological overlap effects, such as a reduction in duplicate research and development efforts. Lastly, technological pairing. If a target firm's technology fills gaps in the patent portfolio of the acquirer, this will result in enhancing the acquirer's innovation prowess or competitive positioning. The table on the right side presents coefficient estimates from the regression model to predict merger pairs. Columns 1 and 3 present the median and standard deviation of the empirical distribution. Before I explain the findings, I will quickly explain each of the measures of technological overlap. Technological proximity measures the closeness of any two firms' innovation activities in the technology space using patent counts in different technology classes. The second, knowledge-based overlap. It measures the extent to which any two firms awarded patents cite the same set of past patents. That is, the extent to which the two firms base their innovation activities on the same underlying body of knowledge. The third, acquirers and targets base overlap ratio. It measures the extent to which the target firms or acquirers' patent portfolio is directly cited by the acquirers or target firm's patent portfolio, and hence captures the immediate importance of a firm's innovation activity to that of another firm. Lastly, acquirers or targets cross-sites ratio. It measures the extent to which the target firms or acquirers' patent portfolio and hence captures the immediate importance of a firm's innovation activity to that of another firm. Thus, this distribution shows a positive and significant association between any of the 4 measures of merger participants, technological overlap, and the likelihood of a merger pair formation, except with 2 exceptions that can be seen in red.
Hi, my name is Adriana Alvarado, and I will continue to discuss Article 2. My first point is the interaction between technological and product market overlap. Our article, Corporate Innovations and Mergers and Acquisitions, uses a patent merger data set from 1984 to 2006. Using a product description from their 10K report, the data concludes that firms with broad product market similarities are more likely to merge than those firms with similar rivals. This is because when close rivals compete, they compete for growth opportunities and market share, which can lead them to pursue related innovation activities that result in the introduction of new products or services, thus resulting in a less positive effect of technological overlap and the likelihood of a merger happening with firms that also overlapped in product markets. We then move on to the types of firms who become the acquirer versus the target. Acquirer firm characteristics include higher innovation outputs. Expenses on research and development are also positive and significant. The intensity does, however, vary depending on the industry and its size match peers. Other characteristics also include size, growth rate, and higher return on stock with lower book-to-value ratios. In contrast, target firms are active in innovation and have a high research and development expense, but have not taken the action to turn them into patents, which result in slower growth. And although they can have better operating performance, they still have lower return on stock. Table 5 represents coefficients from the conditional logic regression to predict merger pairs. It shows the coefficient estimates on measures of technological overlap and the positive and significant association between any of the 6 measures of merger participants and the likelihood of mergers forming. This supports that mergers are more likely to take place between firms whose innovation activities overlap. My second point also discusses technological overlap, but with post-merger innovation outputs. In the next few slides, I will be discussing how technological synergy is a key driver behind mergers and acquisitions, as well as post-merger outcomes, which include the positive relationship of those who have pre-merge technological overlap between merger participants. Table 6, Panel A, shows coefficient estimates with measures of product market relatedness and its interactions with measures of technological overlap. The interaction shows a negative result that are significant from 0, suggesting that when firms overlap in both product market and technological innovations, it reduces the likelihood of merging. Panel B is continuing from Table 6, with the difference of the average probability of a merger based on Panel A. When column 2 is set to 0 on product market relatedness, the effect increases technological proximity, suggesting that the effect of technological overlap on the probability of merger is reduced for firms that overlap in product markets. These findings highlight the importance of a firms simultaneously interact with multiple dimensions. The relatedness of merger participants is critical for post-merger outcomes. Results have shown that productivity increases for those who operate in the same industry as the acquirer. Mergers between firms with product market similarities achieve bigger product expansion, which lead to growth in profitability and sales. Vertical mergers are associated with positive effects significantly larger than those for diversifying mergers. Figure 1 shows the average of the combined innovation output of the acquirer and the target. Both panels show that prior to the bid announcement, the treatment and the control samples exhibit very similar trends in innovation outputs. The average level of innovation outputs is higher for the treatment sample to the control sample without any tech overlap, which is similar between the treatment and the control samples with any tech overlap. For deals with any tech overlap after bid announcement, the average level of innovation output stays flat for the treatment sample, while it drops and has a strong decreasing trend for the control sample. We conclude that our treatment and control sample satisfies the necessary condition to estimate the patent index. The following are highlights to recap article number 2. Results show positive significance between firms' patent portfolios and level of research and development expenses in becoming an acquirer or target. Technological overlap does lead to the likelihood of merger pairing. The positive effect of technological overlap on the likelihood of a merger formation is reduced for pairs that overlap in product market. The effect of a merger on post-merger innovation output is positively related to the degree of pre-merger technological overlap between merger participants. To finish our presentation, the following points are what we hoped you learned. Merger cultural variables include trust, individualism, and hierarchy. Volume and gains improve when culture is aligned between firms. Cost of developing synergy affects total NPV. Innovation activities lead to mergers and acquisitions. Innovation overlap grants synergies fit for merger pairing. Firms with technological overlap and product market overlap reduce the formation of mergers. Pre-merger technological overlap influences post-merger outcomes.